All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike George. I'm a Principal Solutions Architect with AWS. And this is IMP105, using infrastructure and analytics to plan for humanitarian disasters. I'm going to be joined on stage today by a few people. First, Julia Daly, who's the Executive Director of Business Operations Disaster Services at the American Red Cross. And Alicia Morrison, who is a data scientist in the Technology for Development Group at Mercy Corps. And as my role as a solutions architect working with nonprofits, one of the best things I can do is work with folks like Mercy Corps and the American Red Cross to help them do all the really cool things they're doing. They are literally trying to make the world a better place. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the world right now. And you can imagine that there's a lot going on right now. The United Nations has reported that there are around 324 million people across 68 countries who are in need of some form of humanitarian assistance. And keep in mind that this number doesn't count people from more prosperous nations like the United States. This number means that about 1 in 29 people worldwide need some form of humanitarian assistance. This number is up from 2021, mostly due to the crisis in the Ukraine. The UN and partner organizations are targeting to assist 183 million people across 30 countries. And the climate crisis is presenting an immediate threat to the lives and livelihood of many, many people. In 2020, extreme weather conditions drove around 16 million people into food crises across 15 countries. Food crises, in turn, fuel violence and the exploitation of women and children. And in 2020, the UN recognized that climate change and conflict are a core source of famine. And this is evidenced in Madagascar, where climate change is driving famine-like conditions. And so while war and climate change are triggering a humanitarian response, there are many other factors, including things like the COVID-19 pandemic. Of the 7 billion vaccines that have been administered, only around 4% of those have reached countries that are in need of humanitarian assistance. In 2/3 of those countries, an additional 20 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty, and currently around 1% of the world has been displaced. So there's a lot of bad news, but there's a lot of good news as well. And there are many things that need to be celebrated. The UN reported in 2021 that 107 million people were reached by some form of humanitarian response. Food assistance was delivered to 7.5 million people in Afghanistan and 6 million people in Syria, a country that has seen a steep rise in the price of a food basket. Humanitarian action in South Sudan has brought 6 countries back from the brink of famine through a targeted multi-sector approach in the most food insecure areas. Those that were facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, around 500,000 people there have received life-saving assistance, and around 1,000 families have received some form of assistance there. And the World Food Program reports that $1.6 million in cash-based transfers has been provided to people across 67 different countries. But you can imagine that there's still a lot that has to be done. So when you think about a humanitarian crisis, during any sort of humanitarian crisis, speed can save lives. Organizations move quickly to deploy resources to the affected area to support those in need. There's also a technology aspect that in many cases has to be deployed. And in some cases, that technology aspect directly supports those who are helping others during a crisis. In other cases, it supports those who are actually displaced during the crisis. But regardless of who the technology solution is designed to support, nonprofit and humanitarian organizations need to deploy on-the-ground resources and technology resources as quickly as possible so that they can help those who are affected during this horrific time in their lives. But if you think about it, as an organization is trying to provide, the basic necessities like food, sanitary conditions, water, and a place to sleep, they don't want to also have to worry about managing infrastructure or managing technology. Technology shouldn't get in the way of running your mission. It should support your mission. And so again, these resources should just work. So at AWS, we try really hard to meet you where you're at. And by that, I mean that we have over 200 fully featured services that are designed to help you with your specific use case or your need. So in the case of something like a call center, we have a solution to help you out so that you can scale your call center up or down based on call volume, paying only for what you use. Maybe you have some sort of compute that you need. Well, maybe you want to manage virtual machines in the cloud. We have that option for you. Maybe you have a container-based workload that you want to manage. We've got that option for you. And maybe you don't want to deal with any of that. Maybe you just have a piece of code that you want to execute and you don't really care how or where it runs. We have an option for you there as well through AWS Lambda. We have a lot of storage options available for both object and block-based storage. Data processing, we have everything from full elastic MapReduce clusters to data processing pipelines that you can set up through a couple clicks of the mouse. For machine learning, we have a lot of different options for you there, from full-featured machine learning solutions where machine learning practitioners and data scientists can get in and work with data and algorithms and get as deep as they want to. And on the other hand, we have solutions where maybe you don't know anything about machine learning, but you have a specific problem that you're trying to solve. Now, many of the services that I see our nonprofits use are these serverless offerings that don't require much, if any, management. And I see nonprofits be successful with these solutions because, again, they don't get in the way of you trying to run your mission. They just work, and you don't have to worry about managing any infrastructure or anything else that could impact you from delivering 100% towards your mission. Now, not all of us are humanitarian organizations or nonprofits, but I think that there are lessons that are going to be talked about today that will apply to every organization. You're going to hear from both the American Red Cross and Mercy Corps, and some of the things that they're going to be talking about, I think will really resonate with all of you. First of all, you're going to hear a lot about partnerships. The right partnership can make an impossible task not only possible, but successful. You're going to hear about data fluency. Becoming data fluent is quickly becoming table stakes for many leaders. So look at your data and learn how you can tell a story with your data. And you're going to hear a lot about speed. Speed is a choice. Now, it can be hard to move fast. In fact, a few years ago at a previous reInvent, Andy Jassy got on stage and talked about how speed is a muscle. If you exercise it enough, you can get really good at moving fast. But if you don't have that muscle memory built up yet, you can still move fast, but it requires the will to do that. And I found that using AWS Managed Services can help make you move fast so that you can concentrate most on what's important to you and your members. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia at the American Red Cross to talk about what the American Red Cross is doing.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks everyone for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Julia Daly. I'm the Executive Director for Strategic Planning and Business Operations at the American Red Cross. And I am pleased to be sharing a recent example of implementing a brand new technology at the onset of a crisis. And so I'm sure you can all sit in your chairs and imagine a whole list of reasons why it's not ideal to be launching a new system or a new technology at the beginning of a crisis. I'm going to talk just about 3 of the major challenges and risks that we were particularly concerned about in this situation. So first, it's in the name, right? It's a crisis. We don't often know at the beginning of a disaster or humanitarian crisis how many people are actually going to be impacted by the event. We may not know what services specifically they're going to need. We may not know where the people we want to serve are going to be because they're being displaced and having to move out of the area that they've been. Even questions like, what services are we going to be able to provide to what depth are really dependent on how donors are reacting to this specific event and how much money is coming in. So we don't know what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, who's going to need it, right? So a little bit of uncertainty. Next, there is what Mike was talking about. There's a demand for us to move quickly. We're providing life-sustaining services that people need. We really can't afford to thoughtfully design what this platform is going to look like. We can't take time to develop it, maybe pilot it in an area, and figure out what's really working and what isn't. Then we have the challenge, right, of 90% of our workforce being volunteers. So imagine training your volunteers on this new platform after an event has happened. We can't do that if that's going to slow down our service and our mission delivery. So speed's a big concern for us. The third concern that I think a lot of you can relate to is we have to wonder how we're going to support this new system. Are we going to pivot our own internal resources to doing development and sustainment of a platform, or will we try and find a partner that we really have to think about, does this partner understand what it is to work in a disaster or crisis context? Are they going to be able to move at the speed we need them to and put up with a lot of changing priorities, right? So those are kind of the three things that were on the forefront of our mind, thinking about how to support the Polish Red Cross through the response that they were mounting to the Ukraine crisis. So just a little bit of background here. The Red Cross mission is fundamentally to help people and communities that have been impacted by a crisis. It can be a man-made event, it can be a war, a conflict, it can also be a natural disaster, and we also work with chronic issues like poverty. So that's what we do. There are 192 national societies of the Red Cross around the world. And every country has kind of a different specialization depending on what their country specifically needs. So here in the US, American Red Cross, we're actually responding to a disaster every 8 minutes. That's what we're really good at. We also supply 40% of the blood in the US, right? So that's what the US needs from us. That's what we do here. Cruz Roja Mexicana, they actually are offering all of the EMT services in the country. So each national society kind of has their own specialization and specialty. The Polish Red Cross is actually phenomenal at helping families that have been separated during, while they're fleeing a country. If they are trying to evacuate quickly, often families are moved in different directions in different places. So that's the Polish Red Cross's specialty, is reuniting families. What's phenomenal, right, about this largest humanitarian network in the world is that if your national society maybe doesn't have a specialization that another national society does and a need emerges in your country, we have a federation that can leverage the knowledge and skills of another national society and actually deploy in talented people to help you run a program. And so that's what was really happening here in the Ukraine response. Is it was so overwhelming across, essentially 8 countries were having this diaspora of refugees coming in. And so the Federation was supporting all of those national societies. Within Poland at this time, so think about mid-April, about 2 months after the crisis really started intensifying in February. By mid-April, Poland, a country of 14 million people, actually had almost 3 million Ukrainian refugees who had come into the country. What was heartwarming and phenomenal is that a lot of Polish families actually opened up their homes. And so the refugees were largely actually being housed within the communities. So across the country of Poland, almost 1 in 4 homes or something would have Ukrainian refugees staying with them. But what that meant for the Red Cross is a really big challenge. We more often find in a crisis like this that we will have large-scale shelters or camps where refugees are all together, and we meet in person, we sit down, we have a conversation, assess your needs, understand the dynamics of your family, and then can provide services primarily in person. So now we're confronted with a situation where we cannot locate and serve the people that we need to because they are across the country and we cannot locate them. So we had to fundamentally change our service delivery model and quickly to be able to respond to this context. And then just for a moment on the Polish Red Cross, because I mentioned this concern about support, and that was a very acute concern in this particular situation. The Polish Red Cross actually had only a single IT employee, and they were being approached by hundreds of people coming in from other countries and trying to get onto the internet and trying to do very basic things. And so thinking about how do we launch a new technology, what does the support model look like, we knew that we were going to have to outsource. It just was not going to be supported internally by the Polish Red Cross. So here's what we came up with. We knew that we were going to have one of the largest cash programs that the IFRC, the Federation, had ever offered before, was planning to be launched in Poland. And so the desire was to really have this cash program scaling up, and at that time they were telling me that by May 1st, that they really wanted to have the cash program fully automated, and the Polish Red Cross was really nervous about the fact that we had funds to support 10,000 families, but there are 2.7 million potentially eligible families that might want to know, when am I going to get this program? How do I get access? And so we just didn't have in place a good way to communicate what the services were of the Red Cross, what the programs were, when they would be coming online, and even having information about what other partners were providing in this area. So we decided that a contact center was really the right move. We already had a chatbot that was up and running on Viber, which is one of the really popular social media and networking sites there, but we could barely sustain it, right? We didn't have, other than volunteers from the Ukrainian refugee population that were coming in and doing the translation work for us, we didn't have a Ukrainian speaker on staff, right? So there's just a lot of challenges going on at this point in time. But the Polish Red Cross really loved this idea of a central place that Ukrainian refugees could call in, get access to information and services. And so we started the process of understanding what services could actually be centralized and supported through a contact center. And while we were mapping all of that out, we're concurrently trying to figure out what's the right platform, who's the right partner, who's the right vendor to support this. And started to identify some challenging technical requirements as we were talking with the programs about what they wanted to offer. And what we found is that the biggest challenges were we would have approximately 3 or more organizations with active directories that would all be contributing call agents at the center. So we knew that we were going to have a single sign-on issue. We also knew that we needed to have both a knowledge base, a ticketing platform, and the actual call flows available in Polish, English, and Ukrainian, which are not necessarily languages that come off the shelf for most providers. So those were really kind of the big technical challenge that were coming out from our conversations. We talked to a few different vendors, just trying to get a sense of who could meet some of our needs. And quickly, AWS kind of came to the forefront, not just for the technical solutions that they had, but also their willingness to really partner and think not just about their own tech stack and what they could bring to the table, but other partners in this system that we could work with to really build the full solution. So this is what we built. We ended up using AWS Amazon Connect as kind of the backbone of the system. We were able to launch this in 3 weeks' time in 3 languages, and we connected into Zendesk as our ticketing and knowledge-based platform. Again, able to have all of that available in multiple languages so that we wouldn't have our agents attempting to do real-time translation. Everything was in the language that the caller would need that information provided in. We were able to also add some self-service functionality for some of the easier questions that we anticipated getting. So as I mentioned, we actually had a huge number of volunteers coming forward at this time and offering their time and support to the response. And so we added into the call flows the ability to be sent a link to register to volunteer. If people were looking for how to make a donation, we were able to send them the link and the information directly to their phones so that they could not have to speak to an agent, but get the information that they needed, right? And then that's leveraging the Amazon Pinpoint for that real-time self-service SMS integration. And we also did integrate with our chatbots. And what was really cool about this is they had already been up and active for a period of time. So we had refugees that knew to look for content there. But now we were able to escalate those conversations real time to our agents when the chatbot was unable to answer a question sufficiently. So we were just really able to kind of add that next layer of customer service. And finally, what did this all mean, right? We have today provided over 25,000 families with cash assistance. And when I had arrived in Poland, just to kind of compare and contrast how we were doing with our speed to market, we had served 90 families with financial assistance. So it really did take this fundamental change in how we were serving people to be able to reach the numbers that we needed. We started on, you saw we went live on June 1st, which was actually 1 day before the cash program launched. Yes. And we got a single phone call that day. We are now routinely getting 250 calls a day. We have days where we'll take 500 calls. We have had, those chatbot escalations up to our agents, about 600 of those, and most profoundly, for the organization and for future victims of situations like this, we do now have a working group that is meeting to talk about how do we standardize contact center operations across the network? How do we make sure that every single response will have this capability in place? So that's probably one of the most exciting outcomes from my perspective, is that the next time I'm called in to deploy, we'll actually have a platform already picked out and know what to do, how to stand it up even more quickly next time. So that's really the story that I wanted to share with you all today. And I think we will pass this back over to Mike now.
Thanks, Julia. I love that example. I mean, going from nothing to a full-blown call center that's literally saving lives in a month. That's an incredible story. So you saw how the Red Cross, again, went from that idea to that full-blown call center. And in just a moment, we're going to turn it over to Alicia from Mercy Corps to talk about how they're leveraging serverless technologies to move faster. The thing I love about serverless technologies is that you don't have to worry about managing infrastructure. Remember, I said earlier that Technology shouldn't get in the way of your mission. The services scale up and down based on your demand, and like in the case of Amazon Connect, your call center will scale up or down based on the volume of calls you have. You don't have to worry about it. You get the same type of performance as a traditional call center, but with none of the headache or hassle. And if you want to add additional features, you don't have to engage professional services or anyone else. And all of AWS's services follow a consumption-based pricing model. And so that means that you pay literally for what you use. So if you use Amazon Connect today and turn it off tomorrow, you literally pay for the 12 hours or so that it was running. There are no upfront fees or other commitments that you have to make. At AWS, we also like to say that security is job zero. And by that, we mean that security is baked into everything we do because it's the most important thing that we can do. So we give you a lot of options for securing your data. You can use AWS provided keys or your own encryption keys to protect your data. And AWS cannot read your data. All right, so now let's turn it over to Mercy Corps to understand more about their mission and how they're leveraging serverless technologies to plan for the next humanitarian disaster.
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, my name is Alicia Morrison. I'm a data scientist at Mercy Corps. So Mercy Corps is not quite as well known as the Red Cross, unfortunately. So just to introduce our organization a little bit, we are a global humanitarian organization with a commitment to tackle some of the world's most pressing problems. We have about 5,400 people who live and work in more than 40 countries across the globe. We do a wide range of humanitarian development programming that can be anything from sustainable agriculture to youth and gender to cash programming to technology for development, which is where I work. And in 2021, all of these programs reached more than 50 million people across the globe. So Julia just talked about a really great example of how the Red Cross responded to an acute crisis. And in an acute crisis, what we have is a problem that emerges, and it's not something that we're grappling with right now, right, as a humanitarian community. It comes out, and now we need to do things like spin up resources so we can understand the problem, understand what people's needs are, and sort of operationalize humanitarian action from there. But not all crises happen fast. And Mike talked in the beginning of this presentation about climate change, and that can be a great example of slow onset crises. We know that environmental change over time can have impacts to things like food production, water availability, and those kinds of things can result in conflict, displacement, migration. So sometimes you also have cases where all kinds of things kind of happen all at once. You might have sort of that initial conflict lasting a long time. It goes into sort of a sustained conflict. Oftentimes in those types of scenarios, we see economic crises. We see a lot of inflation in those cases, and so you have a crisis in the affordability of goods and services. Then you layer upon that those same countries are grappling with the impacts of climate change. And then maybe you might even throw in a new acute crisis like a natural hazard. Maybe you have a flood or an earthquake, displaces more people and causes even more problems. So all of this results in a really complex humanitarian scenario that requires an immense amount of resources to respond to. So when we talk about like how we're going to respond to a complex crisis, what does that really mean? What are we going to do? So the first thing we might think about doing is adaptive programming. I mentioned that Mercy Corps works in 40 countries worldwide already. That's a lot of programming that's already going on. So what we might want to do is look at information and data about the current crisis, think about how we might forecast how that's going to change in the future, and then take some actions to help our programs meet evolving needs. So change what we're doing based on what we think the scenario is going to become. Another thing that we might think about is planning for anticipatory action, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. we anticipate that there's going to be a crisis, right? Oftentimes we can see some of these things unfold, particularly when we talk about climate change. We know that this is happening. So how can we kind of look at what we think is going to happen, plan a program that helps communities become more resilient against that kind of crisis? So in this case, maybe we think about bringing climate-smart agricultural practices to a community so that as the climate crisis becomes worse, they're more resilient and they feel that impact less. So there's currently a major complex crisis, and I think Mike touched on this a little bit in his introduction. But food security has been on the rise since 2018. And you probably all know that the conflict in Ukraine has resulted in a huge global shortage of food items. And like wheat exports was kind of a headliner for quite a while in the news, right? But even before Russia invaded Ukraine, the increasing frequency and severity of climate shocks, regional conflict, and the pandemic were all taking their toll, disrupting food production and distribution, and driving up the cost of feeding people and families. So Mercy Corps has a 10-year strategy called the Pathway to Possibility, or the P2P, as we like to call it. And so to better support humanitarian outcomes in these complex crises, Mercy Corps has made an explicit commitment to be evidence-driven, meaning we use data, evidence, and analytics to drive impact, scale what works, and to influence others. And we've defined evidence in this case as a connected set of information or facts that we use to help drive decision-making. So what I want to do is kind of share an example of how we're creating data-centric products to help that decision-making process and how AWS is helping us do that. Julia talked a lot about being adaptive, agile, and fast. And even though we're not necessarily doing this in an acute crisis, we're still getting those same sorts of qualities out of the AWS products that we're using to build our global food crisis hub. So there's a few things about doing a data-centric product at Mercy Corps that we've learned over the years. Mercy Corps has a 3-year partnership with AWS. We're just in the end of year 3 of 3. And in those 3 years, we've learned a few things about developing products like this. One is, if you're gonna do data science, it needs to be replicable. We know that it doesn't make sense to look at countries in isolation or to look at locations in isolation. Particularly when you talk about climate, those are regional problems, right? So if you're gonna do an analysis for one country, we gotta figure out how we can scale that to other country contexts as well, right? And we need to develop methodologies and processes that enable that kind of scaling. The second is data access and availability. One, just having access to data and making sure that folks have regular and consistent access to data is super, super important because you can't do data science without it in the first place. But the second part about access and availability is really about making sure that once we've created more information through our data science processes, that information gets to a decision maker in a format in which they can use it and engage with it. And the last one is really like jump-starting that decision-making process and how we use data as a component of it. How do we sort of make that organizational transformation so that humanitarian decision makers are really using data science projects in their decision-making cycle? So part of the Global Food Crisis Hub is looking at how we can forecast global food prices. And we're working really closely to pilot this methodology with our crisis analytics team in Yemen. And the goal of this analysis is to really try to create a forecast for understanding how food prices are gonna change month over month for the next 6 to 12 months. This is really important because Yemen is one of those countries that's facing a major inflation crisis. So everything's becoming more expensive. Mercy Corps does a lot of cash programming, and Julia talked a little bit about how the Red Cross was doing cash assistance to refugees in the Ukraine crisis, and it's effectively the same type of programming, right? It's providing cash assistance to families to make sure that they can secure their basic minimum needs month over month. So by being able to forecast that information we're enabling decision makers to think about how they can adapt their programs. What's the amount of cash that they'll need to provide to really make an impact in people's lives in terms of securing their basic needs? The other piece that this is really important for is donor advocacy, right? Like if we know how much more money this is gonna cost individual households in the future, then we can make a case with our donors for getting more resources to apply to this crisis. So we use Amazon Forecast for this analysis. Amazon Forecast is a time series forecasting tool. It's designed for commercial enterprises originally, and it'll give you a 12-month forecast if you want it. So the important thing about Amazon Forecast is it really enables that concept of scalability for us. All I need to do to generate a forecast is to put the data in the right format, which is like fairly easy. It's like title the columns correctly, right? And you can plug it into Amazon Forecast, and it does all kinds of stuff for you, okay? It fits the model, it does your hyperparameter tuning, it gives you sort of your testing and validation metrics, and it'll even measure model drift for you over time now, I think. It changes all the time. But so I think that's a new feature pretty recently, that you can measure your model drift. So what Amazon Forecast is doing is really enabling that speed of scale, because we know that when we have the next country context beyond Yemen that we want to do this for, we know exactly how to do it. We already have pipelines built. It's a matter of changing a few parameters and getting the right data set in there for the next country context, right? And actually, I'm talking about Yemen, but we did this first in Syria, and we're working on expanding this to other locations in the Middle East and East Africa. So another type of modeling that we're doing is something called systems dynamics modeling. Systems dynamics modeling is of a huge interest to the humanitarian community because its intention is to capture complex, nonlinear dynamics with cause and effect feedback loops. So you can describe the behavior of a system, right? So if you execute an intervention in one part of the system, what does that mean for what might change in another part of the system, right? That's a little bit abstract, but we've applied this to a specific use case, looking at livestock market systems in agro-pastoral regions of Somalia. So what that means is we can look at things like, if there's a drought, how does that change how many cattle are available to agro-pastoralists in these regions in Somalia, right? And so in order to build this kind of model, we use a specialized software called Vensim. And we also use an amazing modeler named Khaled. So that's also good to have in your pocket. But you plug sort of your data and your parameters into Vensim, and it generates the model for you. But we talked about data access and availability, and it's not enough to generate a model, right? We need to have a user interface that enables decision maker to really understand what's happening. How do they toggle that drought? If they want to simulate that they've conducted an intervention, how do they toggle that on and off so they can see what happens in the livestock system itself? So there's another specialty software called SD Everywhere. It's an open source software. You can find it online. And what SD Everywhere does is it takes a Vensim model and it translates it to a web app. So it spits out this list of CSS, HTML, and JavaScript files in a web application. So what we do is we take that web application and we literally just upload it to a tool called AWS Amplify, which is sort of a full stack hosting tool on AWS. So you upload that file set to Amplify, and now my model's online, right? That's literally all I have to do to get that model online. So what this enables is a really fast cycle of development, right? Because we can focus on looking at what our end users are seeing and them telling us what the feedback is. This makes sense to me, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't like how this looks, this isn't working for me. We can focus on that piece of it and how they interact with the information, as opposed to focusing on like, how do we develop this darn web application to service this information in the first place? So AWS Amplify really abstracts away that undifferentiated heavy lifting of hosting a back end for this kind of model. So this has been really invaluable, right? Because we can change the model, just upload the new files, and bang, that new version of the model is online. With just a click of the button, I can actually add password protection to a public URL, which means that I can disseminate that to my internal users so we can do feedback loops without having that public, without having that on the web somewhere where other people can access it. So AWS Amplify has been a really invaluable tool in terms of developing the UI for a systems dynamic model. So the global food crisis is hosted on Elastic Beanstalk. And Elastic Beanstalk is one of a spectrum of services that offer you compute, right? And so that ranges from I want to manage everything to I want to manage nothing. And quite a while ago, a couple years ago, Mike and I had this conversation. I was like, oh, I'm trying to deploy this tool and whatever. And Mike says to me, like, well, what do you want to manage, Alicia? I said, nothing. I don't have time, right? Like, we're a super small team. We don't have a lot of time to worry about load balancing and security groups and NAT gateways and all that other stuff. So Mike started to point us at these managed services where we don't have to do that stuff. And Elastic Beanstalk kind of falls in the middle of that managed services category where a lot of stuff is abstracted away from me. I don't have to worry about it. And I can really easily deploy a new version of this application. This application is also containerized. So if I want to, in the future, have more control over what my backend looks like, I can just migrate it over to EC2, and I can do it that way. If I would need less control and less management, I can migrate it to a tool like Fargate that does almost everything for you. So this is what the architecture of the Global Food Crisis Hub looks like. I really want to quickly touch on that concept of data access and availability again. In the humanitarian space, data is notoriously difficult to wrangle. You've got people publishing data on all kinds of different websites. There are no central repositories. Occasionally, somebody will have a nice, tidy kind of like API that you can just download data from, but it's very rare. Usually it's on an irregular schedule, I'm going to publish an Excel workbook to my website, which you have to find and download, get the tab you want out, mess with that, figure out how to concatenate that to whatever the past data that I've published is. So it's a real mess. So in the first 2 years of our partnership, we really focused on that problem. And we actually have a platform called the Rapid Institutional Crisis Response Platform that is designed specifically around developing lightweight data engineering processes that really enable us to have consistent data in the right place at the right time. And Mike and I gave a talk last year about kind of like what our focus was for those types of lightweight data engineering processes. It's on YouTube, or I'm happy to chat to you about it. But the crux of it is use managed services, right? So most of our pipelines are kind of built on that backend framework that Ricker is kind of underpins, or is underpinned by. So those are all sort of managed services stuff. We stitch together a lot of Lambdas or AWS Batch, because it really depends on what your runtime requirements are, which of those services you use. We can pipe that data through tools like AWS Forecast or Amazon Forecast. We also have some analyses that run containerized on Fargate that we can run that data through. All of the data ends up landing in an Amazon RDS instance. This is a Postgres-compatible Aurora instance with Postgres enabled for our geospatial requirements. We also use S3. This is like a little bit misleading because S3 is kind of an interim step to everything. It's just a great landing zone as you're moving data around the space. But one of the things that's unique about how we've developed the actual front-end application is we've kind of taken the dashboarding component, the actual sort of like data visualization piece out, and given that to a data visualization specialist who really understands how do we design around sort of questions that we're asking of the data. So she does the dashboarding and drops that into S3, drops those files into S3. And then we have a Flask application running in a container on Elastic Beanstalk that can grab those files out. So the most current version of the dashboard is always available to the application. And then, of course, we have our livestock model that runs on SD Everywhere, which we drop into Amplify, and that becomes part of the overall application as well. So when I talked about the three sort of big components that we think about when we're doing a data-centric project, I talked about like putting your data to work for you and really catalyzing change in terms of how we make decisions. And I'd like to stand up here and tell you, like, we've created a global food crisis data hub, and now we use data in all our decisions, and everybody loves it, and it's great. But it's just not like the reality, right? We're still really working on how are we going to use this information, how do we need to, and so forth. So I just wanted to share with you a few things in terms of challenges and opportunities that we've encountered in our organization in terms of moving towards this data-centric model, in terms of being more evidence-driven. So the first thing is awareness, capacity, and skills, right? This is really a human resources problem. The humanitarian community historically has not needed a whole bunch of technology people. And now we're starting to realize that we need the capacity to kind of do these types of analyses. So we need to invest in those skill sets. And to a certain extent, having a partnership with AWS that's enabled us to put things online and show value with these types of data-centric products has really jump-started this kind of awareness and capacity building. Because people are starting to realize, I want those skills so that I can use data. But there's still a really long way to go. And I also believe that there's a long way to go in terms of leadership education and data literacy, right? Not everybody needs to be a data scientist, that's fine. But I do believe that in the 21st century, anybody leading a humanitarian program needs to understand the power of data and what it can do for you and how to use it, how to interpret it. So the second thing is really sort of the opportunity to provide evidence. And I want to really hone in on the concept of partnerships here. Our 3-year partnership with AWS has enabled us to do a wide range of experimentation. It's enabled us to fail because we've not had to worry about the consequences of failing sort of financially, right? Because AWS is helping us out with that. So we're able to do that thing where you don't turn off whatever tool it is, and it costs you a bunch of money on the backside, right? We don't have to stress about that as much. So partnerships with folks like AWS who are really willing to invest in organizations along this data journey is really important. And what it does is it generates evidence for data science in the humanitarian space, right? The evidence is around how data science is valuable. And just like our humanitarian implementers want to use evidence in their programming, we also want to produce evidence so that they understand that this is a value proposition, right, in terms of developing a data science program. So that's really important. The last thing is sort of sufficient investment in fundamental architecture. And I talked about our platform, Ricker, that sort of serves as a fundamental data engineering architecture that underpins a lot of the data-centric projects that we do, right? And so from just a technical perspective, right, it's not really that cool, right? Everybody wants to know how you forecast food prices, and we're gonna predict the future and all this stuff, right? Because that's cool, it's sexy, it's the whole new thing, right? But you can't do any of that, and you certainly can't scale or sustain it if you don't do the hard work of figuring out what the fundamental enterprise level architecture is that you require to really enact a data science program, right? And the other component of that is also ensuring that data science and that evidence is part of your strategy. And so we've done this in our P2P strategy. We've made an evidence commitment, and that's really been a game changer for our team at Mercy Corps, because now folks see that and they say, oh, I need to be evidence-driven. Where do I get that? And they come to us looking for ways that they can be more evidence-driven, right? So really thinking about not just the actual physical architecture, but sort of the people architecting that you have to do and the strategy architecting that you have to do to wrap this up into your organization's vision. So with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Mike to wrap us up here.
All right, thank you. So you've seen how humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross and Mercy Corps have to move fast, right? Speed literally saves lives. But again, speed is a choice, and if you have the organizational will to move fast, you can move fast. You've seen some examples about how both the Red Cross and Mercy Corps have been able to better fulfill their missions by leveraging native cloud services like Amazon Connect, AWS Lambda, Fargate, Amazon S3, and others like that. And again, technology shouldn't get in the way of you trying to fulfill your mission. And so by leveraging serverless technologies, you can get what you need out of technology while still pushing your mission forward. You know, I love the example that Julia gave with the Red Cross about how a partner turned really a near impossible task into not only a completed task, but really a rousing success. If you have something that you need to do and you don't have expertise in a subject, get help. Find a partner. Work with AWS. We want you to be successful. You saw the power of data in the work that Mercy Corps is doing. Data fluency is becoming table stakes for leaders. So look at your data, learn how to tell a story with your data so that you can lead more effectively. And with that, we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to invite Julia and Alicia back on stage. And if you have a question, we have a microphone in the back of the room. Please go back there, and they'll be happy to answer your questions.